Welcome back to A Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. The conservative-led Supreme Court seems to be poised to strike down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited discrimination in voting practices based on race or creed. Part of what started this whole ball rolling was 2 years ago the case of Allen v. Milligan, where the court was set to consider whether Section 2 was constitutional, if whether the way it had been used for the past 4 decades should continue. This section of the Voting Rights Act prevented the establishment of electoral districts that would dilute the voting power of minority voters, essentially preventing the creation of gerrymandered districts that would disproportionately favor white voters by limiting the representation of minority voters. At the time, the court said yes, it's constitutional, and they can continue to remedy discrimination in the voting process in the way outlined by Congress, including establishing new voting districts that are majority minority voters to equalize the representation. And that remained the case for the next 2 years until this year, when a case was brought before the court by a group describing themselves as non-African American voters who claimed that the 2024 Louisiana congressional map was actually unconstitutional because it included a majority black district, one that had been drawn that way to essentially counteract a perceived violation of that section of the Voting Rights Act. The 6 sitting conservative judges on the court expressed skepticism whether that section of the Voting Rights Act should continue, and that there possibly should be a time limit on how long that part should be enforced. Judge Brett Kavanaugh had to say, "The issue, as you know, is that the court's cases in a variety of contexts have said that race-based remedies are permissible for a period of time, sometimes for a long period of time, decades in some cases, but they should not be indefinite and should have an endpoint." And in some sense, he is right. There shouldn't have to be a thing that says we have to protect the rights of non-white voters, in some cases creating special voting districts to counteract other districts in which their representation is purposely lowered. But the end point shouldn't be some arbitrary time. It should be the time when they stop wanting to make majority white districts to disenfranchise minority voters. So while maybe you could make an argument that they shouldn't have to be around forever, they have to be around right now, especially right now when racism and Republican power grabs are at their highest, when gerrymandering is a real risk in the upcoming 2026 midterm elections. And if given the opportunity, majority white Republican states will absolutely redraw their electoral maps to make sure that minority voters do not have a voice and that their white Republican voters dominate in those states while minority Democrat voters do not. It seems very much like the conservative judges on the court forget why the Voting Rights Act was necessary in the first place. The electoral system prior to 1965 was constructed specifically to disenfranchise non-white voters, and the Voting Rights Act ensured equality for all American citizens who vote, regardless of race or creed. And while it would be absolutely fantastic to live in an America where they didn't have to specifically enshrine the non-discriminatory practices in electoral practices, that isn't the America we all live in. We know from historical experience that if left to their own devices, racially discriminatory voting practices will become commonplace, because that's exactly what we have prior to the establishment of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and that's pretty much the only thing that's kept minorities from having an equal voice in the electoral process. I mean, we shouldn't have to have posted speed limits in residential and school zones that prevent you from going over a certain mile per hour, but we know that if they weren't there, people absolutely would. The only thing preventing people from doing things that aren't right are the laws posted that prevent them from doing it. Which isn't to say if the Voting Rights Act were not in place, that every place in all of America would be rife with racist and discriminatory voting practices, but enough of them would be that it has proven to be necessary in 2025. Whether or not they were intended to have an indefinite or a time limit, right now is not when they need to be expiring. If when they drew those congressional maps for that Louisiana election, they felt that the only way to keep it equal and representing everyone in that state equally, they had to add a majority black district, then that's what they had to do. That doesn't seem to me as unconstitutional or outside the interpretation of the Voting Rights Act as it had been previously. So if it weren't for a majority-led conservative court, likely this case wouldn't go through. But as we have 6 of the Supreme Court justices being conservative, there's a good chance that they're going to decide that, yeah, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act has done its job and it needs to be retired. We see time and time again that racism in this country is alive and well and is deeply ingrained in many aspects of our culture, including the electoral process. So the last thing we need is the Supreme Court making it easier to disenfranchise minority voters and to ensure that their voices do not have equal say as their white counterparts. And it's important to note that currently a majority of under 18 people in this country are people of color, and by the end of this decade, it is predicted that half of the under 30 people will be people of color. So eliminating the safeguards that make sure that those people are going to have their proper representation in the electoral process seems to me like a move intentionally put in place to disenfranchise them and to ensure that a minority white vote is the only one that matters. I don't think there's really any solid argument to eliminate any part of the Voting Rights Act, especially this Section 2, other than racism. Since Donald Trump took office, it has seemed like one of the key priorities of the administration and of the Supreme Court seems to be to remove any and all discriminatory protections and the scrapping of anything that even includes the word diversity or inclusion. Increasingly, there's just no argument that this administration isn't one of white supremacy and discrimination against any and all minority groups. If the Supreme Court does in fact end up ruling against Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and that in effect that 2024 Louisiana congressional map was unconstitutionally drawn, it will absolutely set the stage not only for massive disenfranchisement of minority voters, but also solidify Republican control across states, since voters of color predominantly vote for the Democratic candidates, and Republican representatives tend to be mostly white themselves. And that's the idea. It taps into that fear by white conservatives that they're going to lose their control as minorities become a larger part of our society and therefore will have a larger voice in future elections. America as a whole is becoming less white, and they will do whatever they can to make sure that if they can't stop the electorate from becoming less white, they can at least make sure that they aren't able to be represented equally. They know that if they can't count on racially discriminatory gerrymandering, they have very little chance of winning many elections. And of course, as the political party that opposes progress, it is anti-progressive and is in fact regressive, this isn't exactly surprising. This nation has a long and established history of racism, so to ignore that and remove some of the very few counterbalances still in place in our electoral system is absolutely wrong, unless returning to those racist practices of the past is exactly what they want. I won't go as far as to say that the 6 conservative Supreme Court justices themselves are racist, but I do think that they are willing to rule in a way that emboldens those who are, and that's pretty bad on its own. Though honestly, the way the court is right now, I would not be shocked if Loving v. Virginia and Brown versus Board of Education would be next to be struck down and we can forget about interracial marriage and desegregation. Now, of course, that's hyperbole, but the point is that once you start eroding at these established protections, it's not hard to imagine a time where those much more major ones also come tumbling down with them. A rock slide doesn't start with the big boulders. It starts with the small rocks coming down, loosening the earth, and then the big rocks come falling. With a very important midterm election coming up next year, this is the absolute wrong time to be loosening restrictions on racial protections in voting. Even if you argue these protections do have an inbuilt time limit, I would absolutely say this is not that time. A lot more has to change in our society before we can even consider the sorts of protections the Voting Rights Act enshrined as unnecessary or antiquated. As with many things, Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh has said he is wrong on this one. If anything, we need more robust protections, not less. But with a majority conservative court, I think we can pretty much assume that that's not happening. And I think that's very sad to see. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this episode of A Slice of News. I've been your host, Mr. Slice, and until next time, when I cut you off another slice of news.